We're here with Dr. Don Middleton. We're so happy to have you here. I know that currently you're working out at the Meadows out in Wickenburg, Arizona, which is a very well-known treatment center. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today.
No, it's my pleasure, Kim. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so instead of talking about the treatment process and the world that you're in when it comes to that aspect of it, I wanted just to get your take as a physician, as somebody who, helps people from the very beginning in the treatment process to kind of that what happens afterwards, that support that they need. And we know a lot about, programs like AA and support groups like that. And I thought I'd just ask you for your take on that. And, are those important, or is that something that you recommend when people leave treatment?
Without a doubt. About 90 years ago, they invented this 12-step program. It was a doctor and a stockbroker back in New York who were both desperate to get sober, and they'd been hospitalized dozens of times. And that's what they did back then, was just hospitalize people to detox them, and then they'd drink on their way home. But there just wasn't anything that was effective in long-term sobriety. And these guys used some principles from Judeo-Christian background, mostly from the New Testament. But they built these 12 steps where people can work their way through them in order to achieve a long-term sobriety. Now, they thought that the magic was in the 12 steps back then. And the 12 steps are really good in helping a person clean up the wreckage of their past and find a new way to deal with the problems of their life and clean up some of their character defects. But the real magic behind AA and all those other 12-step groups is actually in the fellowship and the doing it with other people. Addiction, the opposite of addiction isn't abstinence. People want to say, just quit using. And that's not the way to get healthy. That's just, you still feel bad and you're not using what was your medicine in the past. The opposite of abstinence is just use. The opposite of addiction is community and emotional and spiritual sobriety within a community. And so the secret sauce to AA and all those other A's is actually the going through the steps with another human. You see, addiction is just full of shame because people think I should be able to do better. They don't understand that their brain's been hijacked by their genetics and whatnot. And so they feel like I should be able to do this on my own, but you can't. And after you fail over and over and over again, they finally surrender to, I need help. And then when you have become so isolated, and everybody at the end of addiction will tell you that their life became so isolated that it was just absolutely demoralizing and painful, then they have to relearn how to talk to other people about feelings and listen to other people about their problems and cooperate and trying to just do little things like make sure the coffee gets made and the chairs are set up right and all the cigarette butts are picked up. Just tiny little things as you learn to adult again in your life.
Yeah, I think I've heard it once that, getting sober isn't necessarily the hard part.
Yeah.
You can find a way to get sober. It's the staying sober that's the key. And then it's not only just being sober, in other words, not relying on those mind-altering substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs or whatever, but it's actually getting into recovery. And recovery is different, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. So is when you're talking about this idea of having a fellowship or having people to go through this with and having that support, is that what you're really talking about, is that ability to kind of get into that long-term, get back to, what your life is supposed to be like, but having some support and being in a place of recovery?
Yes, because those people have done it before you, and they have empathy. Now, there's plenty of people around that will have sympathy, but empathy is a totally different game. Sympathy says, oh, you fell down in a hole. That looks like it really stinks. I'm glad I'm not you. And empathy says, I'm going to climb down here in the hole with you, and when you're ready, we'll climb out together. And that is what these people bring to the table, is they've been there and they've done it and they've found a way out. And that gives the person who's trying to achieve sobriety some hope that there is a way if they can just get their ego out of the way and listen and surrender. Surrender is everything in sobriety. It's everything. And you just cannot make this a self-help book. It has to be with other people, because part of the disease is isolation.
So I think about it, and before we get into particularly, maybe some specifics about the 12 steps, because we're talking about that today. We could talk about the fact that there are other support groups, and many of them probably very helpful as well. We're just focusing in on that one, and you sort of put it in the context of what the real issue is, and that's being in fellowship with others. Yeah. But before we jump into some specifics about it, just to deal with the fact that I've heard it said, well, it's really not that successful. They're all over and and all that stuff, but is it really successful, or is this really the what people need? And I don't know how to answer that question, because it seems like it needs to be put in context a little bit.
In addiction medicine, it's really interesting because it depends on how you ask the question, whether it's successful or not. I can make AA look terrible and say, what percentage of the people walk through the door are sober 5 years later? Or I can make them look great by saying, how many people that hang out for 5 years in AA are sober for the rest of their lives? It has to do with how you ask the question and what your goal is by asking the question. AA has a spirituality component to it, and that rubs some people wrong. They don't want to talk about God, or they have been hurt by churches or by someone that said they were religious, and so they don't want anything to do with it. And so they ask the question in such a way that makes AA look awful. But it is the only thing that we've learned at least up until now, that has what we'll have to call, at the best, decent numbers for long-term recovery. It's really hard to find out what the real numbers are, because the second word is anonymous, and those people don't participate in studies very much. They want to be left alone, and they still want just to walk away saying, it's not about me, it's about the fellowship.
And the key here is to not put it in isolation. It's not that, you just look at it as, okay, you just go to AA. That could work for some people. But when you're talking about individuals that have, like in your case, you work at a treatment center. You're dealing with people that are going through a treatment program. Usually, it's medically supervised, obviously. And so they're going through a process of treatment. And what you're saying is this is kind of that next step of it.
Well, it's a complementary step. There's a lot of people that start drinking or using drugs or whatever in the first place because they've got a mental problem. And so you might need the 12-step groups to help you with your addictive process, but you still have a bipolar disorder that needs serious medical care, or crushing depression that needs help. And so it's a team approach. You have psychologists, psychiatrists, medical component, and the community component.
So when they finally get to the point where they're engaged in, maybe a 12-step meeting or something like that, talk to us a little bit about, why you think that's helpful to them. What are some of the steps, and why is that going to be helpful to their long-term health?
Okay. The thing that happens to a person as they go through their addiction life is they develop, I guess we'll call them bad habits or character traits that are basically center around selfishness and grandiosity, and then also this bizarre grandiosity with an inferiority thing. So when someone in an AA room says, I'm a egomaniac with an inferiority complex, every head in the room shakes. Yeah, we get that. And it's a real odd kind of character development that needs to be broken down, and it isn't broken down easily because of the grandiosity. So the first couple of steps are just about breaking down the I can fix this on my own and surrendering to the process. And the very first step is admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. Well, if you can just do the first half of that first step for the rest of your life and admit you're powerless, you have a pretty good shot at that making this whole thing work out for you. But surrender isn't a part of it. It's everything. What keeps a lot of people from what keeps a lot of people relapsing throughout their sober career is that difference between the words surrender and submission. Now, I always used to think of these things were the same thing, but submission is more like complying and going along to get along and trying to get some steam off the pot and get out of trouble. And submission says, I'll put down my weapon and not fight, but I know it's right there if I want to pick it up and fight again. And surrender says, I'm just tired of the pain. I can't take it anymore. Take my weapon and melt it down into a wind chime. I'm done, 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 done. And God looks at that and says, now that I can work with. And these people surrender, and then they can start cleaning up the mess that they've made. So that's the first 3 steps. Then we go through taking an inventory of their life and seeing how they've affected themselves and other people around them and how other people have hurt them and just taking an inventory so they know what they're dealing with and what kind of bad habits they've, like every time I get close to someone I push them away or that kind of thing. And so you do that and you spend some time in confessing this to someone else and talking about it and getting it out on the table so we can look at it subjectively and say, this can be worked with. This can be done. You're not the first person that invented selfishness or greed or lust. This is something that can be dealt with. And so they spend the next few steps trying to work with character defects and then approaching people whom you've harmed and trying to make amends for the wreckage of your past. And then the last 3 steps are about kind of a maintenance program. It's spending time in prayer and meditation, examining your day every day and see if there's something new that you've done that needs to be made amends for. And then finally, the 12th step is about serving others and trying to help other people out of this hole.
Yeah, so you mentioned God in all of this, and that is obviously one of the issues that some people, they get frustrated with AA because it's kind of changed over the years, and they use either words like higher power or God or what that means to you, things like that. And without getting into the controversy of people being frustrated over the language, the concept, what is that concept and why is that important?
Well, by the time a person walks through the rooms of AA, and when I say AA, I mean like Narcotics Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous, and there's like 50 of them, Overeaters Anonymous, and a whole bunch of them. But by the time someone walks through those doors, they have tried to quit on their own, usually dozens or hundreds of times, and failed. And it's because they're just physically unable to. And they need a higher power, is what the program says, something with more power than they have. Now, some people are willing to say, well, the group can be my higher power. And if that's what gets you sober, then okay. Or other people might say, well, Allah or God or Jesus is my higher power. And that's fine. Whatever gets you past thinking that you can fix this totally by yourself, that's where you want to go, because that's the secret to understanding that you aren't alone in this universe. You are part of a universe, and there is love and there's support and there's power that's beyond you. And that's how we feel like that it seems to work for those people, is to help them reconnect with the universe and be part of God's plan.
Yeah, and I think at the end, if you look at all of those steps, they're kind of a good way to live your life.
Yeah, everybody should do the 12 steps, but they're hard. No one wants to go and write down every crummy thing they've ever done in their life, And so most people won't do them because they're not compelled to by circumstance. But they have been around. Not a whole lot of things in psychology have been around for 90 years and still going strong. And so this is a tried and true way, we know, to supplement medical care.
Well, really appreciate you talking about that. It's definitely a component of treatment. It's definitely a component of that restoration and getting somebody back to, the life that they want to have.
Yeah. It's just not enough to be physically sober. You can be physically abstinent and lead a miserable, miserable life. It's when you learn how to deal with emotions and have your emotional and spiritual sobriety, that's when you go from being in recovery to recovered. Out at the Meadows, sometimes we'll talk and say, recovery is not even a good word for this, because that brings to mind, like, if I recover data from my computer, I get it back to where it was before. But we don't see that in people in recovery. When they go through recovery and they get healthy, they're way better than they were before. They're transformed beyond where they were. And so recovery is actually kind of like a weak word compared to what we actually see people doing.
Oh, well, thank you so much for talking about that today, and we really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure, Kim. Thank you.